Okay. Good evening. I'm Paul Cool, one of the co-chairs of the CAT, and I would like to welcome you to another one of our frequently asked questions presentations. The Lambertville Community Advisory Team, or as we call it, the CAT, is comprised of 20 Lambertville residents with diverse backgrounds and varying views on redevelopment in the city. We are all committed to listening carefully to questions about the redevelopment, and in this case, of the police station site. Joining me today are two members of the CAT, Cindy Vaughn and Shirley Kessler, who will be asking Vince Mazzei of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection Agency questions relating to the development in close proximity to a C1 waterway in New Jersey. Vince served as the Assistant Commissioner of the NJDEP for Watershed and Land Management, overseeing the Division of Watershed Protection and Restoration. He began his career with the Department of Environmental Protection in 1988 following his graduation from Stevens Institute of Technology. He is a licensed professional engineer in the state of New Jersey and is considered an expert in flood risk analysis and mitigation. Vince authored the New Jersey Flood Hazard Area Control Act rules. He also serves as the chairman of the New Jersey Association of Floodplain Management. Shirley, the floor is yours.
Okay, so Vince, you are just the guy that we need to talk to. So first of all, did you get the questions and did you receive the environmental constraints police station lot map?
I did, thank you,
Okay.
and that was very helpful.
So you can see the territory we're talking about. So as you might imagine, many people in our town are very concerned about the possibility of doing a big development so close to a creek that we all love. And it's actually a very beautiful creek if you walk down there and sit next to it. So can you start by just giving us some general considerations that need to be taken into account as we think about developing that close to a creek? And I don't know if you receive, I actually put on my fitness watch and I walked over to the creek and I walked directly towards the lot, and from the edge of the creek to beginning of the rise, there's a point where it rises probably, I don't know, 50, 75 feet, whatever, 50. That's somewhere in the range of 275 to 300 feet. So given that.
Okay, well, first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that I love, environmental protection and protecting public safety. And so, and just as a side note, I'm a nearby resident. I live in neighboring Delaware Township, so I'm very familiar with Lambertville, and
Nice.
I've been to the site many times. I know to slow down to 35 as I'm passing that site. So,
Well, it's a police station.
yes. So as not to get in any trouble. So, I have walked the site. I haven't measured it out like you did, but there's really two considerations when development is being contemplated near waterways. In our New Jersey's Flood Hazard Area Control Act rules, there are two overlapping areas of jurisdiction. There's what we call the flood hazard area, which is larger than the 100-year storm. In Lambertville, the 100-year flood the design flood, or our flood hazard flood, is about 4 feet higher than the 100-year flood. So it's a bigger floodplain. And when you're driving up 29, you can kind of look across to Delaware, to New Hope and different parts of Pennsylvania. You can see that the houses are lower. They tend to be lower because our standards in New Jersey are higher. So the first consideration is, are we placing people in harm's way by putting them in the floodplain? This site, according to the FEMA mapping of our design flood, the parking lot and the building appear to be outside the floodplain. Seems like the floodplain wraps around the back edge of it. I don't know how extensive the development plan is for the site. So the rear part of it would nip at the edges of the floodplain, but where the development that I'm aware of on site it should be not in the floodplain. So that's a help, because then that's not a consideration that you'd have to concern yourself with. The main reason why is because if you were planning to put any kind of housing in an area that's a flood zone, especially like multi-residence buildings, we would want to make sure that people could get in and out of the site without being trapped. And so that's not a problem at that site. The second consideration, the other overlapping area of our jurisdiction, is called the riparian zone. And the riparian zone comes in 3 flavors, basically, in New Jersey: 50 feet, 150 feet, and 300 feet.
Define riparian zone for
Yes, absolutely.
people who will be watching this.
Right. So the riparian zone is either 50 feet from the top of bank, or 150 or 300 feet from the top of bank on both sides of all surface waters in the state. And the classification of it, whether it's 50, 150, or 300, depends on the resource that's being protected. So as Alexaquin Creek is a Category 1 water, it's afforded a 300-foot riparian zone. Now, in that riparian zone, it's measured outward from the top of bank, and what our regulations are designed to preserve and protect vegetation in that area, especially trees. And there are different standards. The closer you get to the water, the more stringent the standards get. So kind of speaking to your point that it looks like the toe of the slope of the fill, the historic fill that was there, is maybe 275 feet or so from the top of bank. So that would mean just the edges of that parking area and some of the trees that are along the edge there would probably be within the riparian zone. Now, there are standards that permit some disturbance in a riparian zone. Trees cannot generally be cut in the inner half of the riparian zone if it's 300 feet. So, but you're outside of that, so you're on the very edges of it. So there is a provision to do some minor removal of vegetation with appropriate mitigation or compensation, which basically would mean planting trees someplace in the same riparian zone to compensate for what's being lost. And there's some limits that can be placed on that. Now, development of paved areas or areas that are occupied by buildings, even if that's in a riparian zone, that's not a problem generally, unless you're right on top of the water or very close to the water, because there's no vegetation there. So where the parking lot is, let's say that the 300-foot riparian zone extended into the parking lot a bit, that shouldn't affect the redevelopment of that area because it's already devoid of vegetation lawfully.
Okay.
Yeah. Cindy, do you have a follow-up before I?
You're muted, Cindy.
Yeah, I see that. No, I think the description of the riparian zone will be very important for people to understand, because I think that's what in large part they're concerned about. So no, I think that was very good.
Good.
Now, Vince, the plan at this point, or the thought, is that the development will take place entirely on the footprint of the current police station. So it will all be on that level. There will, however, need to be a wall, a retaining wall, built at the point where that slope comes up from at the bottom there of that. So
Right.
that will need to be strengthened and all. And the next question I have, and that is about runoff. So first of all, let me just say that there is the suspicion that there is some contamination of soil that is under the police station. And so all of that soil will need to be dealt with, as in removed, replaced, and firmed up. But then, as we're talking about the property, the idea is that we would have some mitigation of runoff from the site using rain gardens, and perhaps you could talk about what methods could be used in order to mitigate any kind of undesirable runoff.
Runoff into the creek, absolutely. Yeah, so we do have stringent controls on the runoff that can go into a 300-foot riparian zone. And I think that's kind of what you're speaking to. But we've learned a lot about stormwater management over the last few decades. When I started my career, stormwater management generally was you dig a big hole and put a bunch of pipes in the ground and you just put the water someplace for a while and hope that it, does what it's supposed to do. But we've learned from that. And so our stormwater management rules, even recently were adopted, some amendments were adopted that incorporate, green infrastructure, right? So there are ways, the optimal thing is to have stormwater interact with vegetation, right? So things like green roofs, rain gardens, vegetated areas, right? So having that rainwater runoff infiltrate into vegetated areas, that's optimal. If the site is, let's say that the soil is remediated and clean fill is placed and it's compacted to a certain amount, it's hard to say how much infiltration could occur. Sometimes what people do is you can collect the water and you would generally pre-treat it to some level, and then you could put it back into the ground to a certain extent. And generally you can't do that for like the large flood storm events, 100-year event or something. It would be just too much water. But, generally up to the 2-year event, it depending on the soil type and the depth and how the compactability of it, you could probably infiltrate a decent amount of water. So the thing that is, the thing that's to your favor is the fact that the site is developed already. So it already has pavement and it already has a roof. So stormwater rules are designed to manage increases of that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, right. So it gives you some credit for the fact that there's already development on the site.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I would think that you'd have some opportunities there to do some green infrastructure, to do some rain gardens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So just to jump in, Shirley, so my question would be, what can we require? I mean, so this is a community team and we're exploring this. And I think a lot of the question is my dog, what can we require the developer to do? Because I think that is a concern of the community, because usually a developer comes in and does what a developer does. So in regard to that, is there anything we can do to make requirements of them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I certainly, we the department certainly encourage and would be very happy to help work with people who are interested in incorporating green infrastructure into their design. That being said, the standards are relatively stringent at the state level. And so, there would be nothing that would be holding Lambertville back from having additional standards if there was concerns about runoff. If there was we always encourage people to go above and beyond, right? Not to just meet the minimum. So I think you do have some opportunities there for that. And I would think that the city probably could have that option to require treatment that's beyond what's required by the state. We're obviously fans of that, of going above and beyond the minimums.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Now, just to interject, currently that the area that we're talking about is covered by pavement, basically. And we currently will have, I would imagine, we already have runoff coming off of that from cars that are parked there and any other work that goes on there. So our hope would be to turn all of that around and
Mm-hmm.
create an environment that's much more adaptable to taking care of the creek.
Mm-hmm.
And such.
I do think you have an opportunity there. I haven't spent a lot of time at the police station. I'm happy to say, at least not against my will anyway. But I did walk around the parking lot a bit to take a look at it, and I didn't see a stormwater collection system. There could be one there, but I don't think there is.
I don't think
so. Right. So that's kind of that actually presents you with a great opportunity, because today runoff would, I suppose, be cascading off the edge of that pavement and down that slope that you spoke of, which is probably not doing wonders for that slope. It's relatively steep, if I recall. So you have an opportunity here now to collect the runoff and provide some treatment before it's let go. And so you can provide some additional, the measurement in the state is called total suspended solids. so discharges within riparian zones have to meet certain standards. And so depending on where you are in a 300-foot riparian zone, you have either a 50 or, I'm sorry, an 80 or a 95% TSS removal, total suspended solid removal. TSS is this kind of a surrogate for other pollutants and whatnot, because it's a good measurement of other things too. So, long story short, you do have an opportunity there to capture the water, to infiltrate it, to have it connected with vegetation. And so you could potentially improve things. Which I would.
What about, it's quite different to have a 4-story building there as opposed to a 1-story structure that's there now. What kind of considerations need to be made around sort of environmental ones when you talk about a building of that size?
We don't have standards in our flood hazard rules or our wetlands rules dealing with the height of a building from an environmental point of view. As if I put my engineer hat on, I would say that if you have a large building and it's on fill, then you would want to make sure that it's properly compacted and it's structurally adequate, obviously. But other than that, it really, from an environmental point of view, it shouldn't really matter whether it's a 1-story building or a 4-story building. From the health of the stream and flood zones and whatnot.
Yeah. Cindy, I have one more question, and that is, what do you, your knowledge, what do you think that the Canal Commission would be expecting of us in this process? Because that in many ways is an equally stringent standard to meet.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, I would defer to our friends at the DNR Canal Commission. I did work as a review engineer there for a few years, so I can kind of give you some outline of the standards that you would have to meet. So the canal obviously passes through the rear of the site, as you know, and well, further back. Anything within 1,000 feet of the canal is called Zone A, and beyond that, Zone B. And Zone A has more stringent standards because you can generally see the development from the canal. So things like the visual aspect of the development, if you can see it from the multi-purpose path along the canal, there's an aesthetic component. There's also—
You mean the canal or the creek?
The canal.
The canal, okay.
Yeah, so if you're biking along the canal, walking along the canal path, it's pretty amazing how it can go through some urbanized areas and you feel like you're in nature, right? It's kind of like a contained thing. And so, especially when it passes through towns, if development can be seen from it, then there are some aesthetic considerations to be made, right? So like the visual aspect of it. There's also, the Canal Commission has stormwater management rules that are very similar to DEP's in this regard. And they have something called a stream corridor, which is the 100-year floodplain plus 100 feet. So I don't know where that lands on the site, but I would think a portion of the site probably lies within that stream corridor. But there are, again, ways that especially if the development is outside the 100-year floodplain, there's some provisions in the regulations for that. So again, I wouldn't want to speak for them, but those are the basic considerations that you'd have to meet. Right. And I'm sure that they'd be happy to talk to you about that.
Yeah. Cindy?
Yeah. So I think I go back to, I think probably a lot what we hear from our community is how we're going to protect the residents that may live there, and also keep in keeping with Lambertville. And so I guess I go back to the approval process and what Lambertville can really do. We've been having extensive conversations about design, et cetera, and that's really not what you're here for, so I'm not going to get into that. But in your experience, what a municipality, when it's approving a redevelopment project, how much can they go above and beyond Or not even above and beyond, do we have to enact ordinances, or do we have to take other actions if that's the concern of the community, to basically have the redeveloper listen to what we're suggesting?
Yeah, that's kind of a hard question for me to answer, because I would think it would depend on your, you know, your regulatory authority and you know, the way your municipal ordinances are established. Many municipalities in the state have more stringent standards than the minimums, as I mentioned. So, you know, if a higher TSS removal rate, or a higher stormwater management treatment rate, or a bigger stream buffer, you could, there's nothing on the state level that would prevent a community from doing something like that. So, yeah, but you know, to your actual authority, I couldn't only speculate how much extra you could make them do.
No, I appreciate that. I just think it's something that people want answered. And I think you answered this, and I'm pretty confident I know, but just because I think it'll be good to have it repeated. So when you're doing construction and you're at a C1 water body, again, could you just emphasize how far construction can come within proximity to that? Because I think, you know, you've got the creek, we've got the slope, we've got the elevation, we got all that. If you could just go through that again, I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. So we, along Category 1 waters and their tributaries, we protect vegetation within 300 feet from the top of bank. So presumably that slope and the trees that are along that slope would fall into that. Maybe I think it's right on the edge of it. And so there are protections in place for that vegetation. Now there are provisions for a relatively small amount of removal of vegetation with mitigation, as I said. So for example, in a 300-foot riparian zone, you are allowed 6,000 square feet of disturbance for something like a parking lot or you know, things like that. There are different provisions for roads and utility lines, and the standards and the rules are commensurate with the use of it and the type of it. But generally speaking, the riparian zone is designed, the riparian zone standards are designed to allow things like infrastructure necessary, you know, roadways, utility lines, things like that, beneficial projects, roadways, you know, environmentally beneficial projects. So something like say a parking lot or a building, you would have that 6,000 square foot limit that you would have to try to work around. Now, there is a provision in the rules that if there's a hardship, you can go beyond any of the standards in the rule if you can demonstrate that there's a compelling argument. And there are some times where we recognize that will allow more disturbance, and then of course then you just would have more compensation, more mitigation. And one thing that we do like is that if disturbance is happening on the very edges of a riparian zone, which is I think what this would be, there's an opportunity to take the vegetation, the compensatory vegetation, and put it closer to the channel, right? Because there's some areas I think that are cleared in there and that probably lend themselves to the opportunity of being enhanced. You know, native non-invasive vegetation could be planted in there and maintained, and I think that would do a lot for the stream corridor.
Mm-hmm.
So just to explain to our community, when you say a hardship, that's a hardship on the developer, or is it a hardship?
It's on the hardship on whoever owns the property, right? So if the city owns the property, then the city would have to make the argument that strict compliance with the regulations would constitute a hardship. It's not easy to get for Category 1 water, particularly, right? We do take a very close look at it. But that being said, we recognize that there are, you know, especially with redevelopment projects, that, you know, you can't, a small amount of disturbance might be unavoidable. And so that's why we have that provision for 6,000 square feet.
So, do we have one more short question? We're about out of time, and it's been fantastic, Vince, the information you've given us. But the one more closing thought that you have for us that the developer should pay attention to?
Yeah. I think one thing that, you know, again, this is kind of also with my engineering hat on, but also from my environmental hat, The slope interests me because I'm assuming that it's been filled, and I think Shirley, you mentioned something about maybe a retaining wall being placed there, and so that could be pretty high, and it could be pretty expensive to build something like that. So you'd want to look into that, what kind of options you have there. I think that if you were going to put a building near that, you would have to have a relatively robust wall.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but again, it depends a lot on the soil type and the proximity of the development to the wall and whatnot. A parking lot up to a wall is one thing, or a lawn area is one thing. Having a building there is something else. So that's just a consideration I would have if I were planning a redevelopment of that property.
Okay, great. Vince, on behalf of the CAT, thank you very much for taking time out of your crazy schedule to sit down and chat with us tonight. We appreciate we clearly appreciate it, and your knowledge of the subject matter and the site has been great. And Shirley and Cindy, thank you very much for taking the time to ask these very important questions. In closing, what I'd like to say is that if anybody listening to this has any other questions relating to environmental issues at the police station site, please feel free to email us at catchairs. Our email address is catchairs@lambertvillenj.org. You can also go on the city website and under the boards and commissions drop-down tab, hit that and the drop-down tab, and you'll see community advisory team. So you can get information to us that way. So again, thank you very much to everybody, and it was great presentation.
Thank you.